Hello everyone, and welcome back to Feeding His Sheep. Today we're going to conclude our study of the Old Testament book of Obadiah. Now in the first half of the book of Obadiah, we read about the prophet giving the word of the Lord to the nation of Edom. If you happen to have a red letter Old Testament, you will see that after the introduction, after the identification of Obadiah the prophet, the rest of this book is red lettered, meaning it's a direct message from God. And the message for Edom is that wrath is coming. You know, all throughout history, the Edomites have shown contempt for the people of God. They've shown nothing but contempt and strife with the nation of Israel. But that is not all. Though it isn't mentioned in this book, they have also been showing contempt for God. You would think that they would be worshipers of God. You think they'd be worshipers of Yahweh, being as how Esau was also the son of Isaac, just as Jacob was. He was the grandson of Abraham. But somewhere along the line, the descendants of Esau, which became Edom, strayed from the God who created them. Up until the time somewhere around the 8th century BC or so, it's believed that the Edomites still did worship the God of their fathers, the God of Israel. The book of 1 Samuel mentions an individual named Doeg the Edomite, who apparently worshipped the God of Israel. Early Egyptian records reference a place called Yahweh, with similar spelling to what Israel has it, in the land of Shashu. It's a Semitic-speaking nomads living where the Edomites lived historically. But things changed when these Edomites, or these Idumeans as they're also called, lost their national identity under Persian rule. So it appears that after that, they adopted the faith of some of those in the vicinity of the Jordan area and began worshiping something called Kos. That's Q-O-S. Now, Kos was almost forgotten until Herod the Great revived the cult for the Idumeans in an effort to gain the favor of the people who were still clinging to their old gods, who still held on to the old traditions. Now, this is the same Herod who also put a lot of money into remodeling the temple in Jerusalem. So whether it's the Edomites or whether it's the Jews, it seems like Herod is always trying to play whatever side is convenient for him politically. But surprisingly, in the list of things that Edom is being condemned for, there is no mention of them following this false god, Kos. And I imagine it may be due to the fact that the population of Kos has waned about the time of Obadiah. They've fallen away from that, since Herod is going to have to revive it from obscurity in just a few generations later. But the crimes of the Edomites were plenty enough, without having to bring in their belief system or their false gods. We began in the first half of the study with one of them mentioned by Obadiah. Edom had laughed and rejoiced while Israel was being ransacked by Babylon. Not only did they not come to their rescue and not try to help them, but they also thought it was funny. So let us go further and see their sins as a nation being tallied up, and the total bill for the wages of their sin is being delivered. We're in verse 13 of Obadiah. It says, "Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their disaster. Yes, you do not gloat over their calamity in the day of their disaster, and do not loot their wealth in the day of their disaster." You know, if you just read this verse, it kind of sounds like they're simply being warned about things that they should not do. But at this point, they have already done all of these things. All of them which we are about to read, this and the future verses. These are not just rules being calmly handed down to them. It's a list of violations that have already been committed. When it says do not do these things, technically it should say you should not do these things. You shouldn't have done them. After Babylon had raided the cities in Judah and carried away the people into captivity, the Edomites went into the city and looted what they could. They cared nothing at all about the fate of their distant cousins, the Israelites. They didn't care about the possibility that they could be next in judgment. They just went in and took whatever they wanted. It was a free-for-all. They took people's clothes, they took food, whatever livestock wasn't taken away by Babylon, they took their gardening tools, anything they can get their hands on. Some of them even lived in the empty houses that were left behind in Judah. So we see the Edomites are being charged with gloating over the misfortune of others and stealing and looting. But wait, there's more. Look in verse 14. Do not stand at the fork of the road to cut down their fugitives, and do not imprison their survivors in the day of their distress. This was lower than low. How wicked can a people get? As Nebuchadnezzar entered the city and he began invading it, many of the Israelites fled. They headed for the hills. As Nebuchadnezzar and his armies coming in the front, there's a few of the citizens fleeing out the back. Some of them possibly ran to the hills of Edom, seeking sanctuary. If they did, they were not given asylum, but they were seized and they were handed over to Babylon. The language of this text paints a picture of them setting up an ambush on the paths, on the common roads and the pathways, catching anyone who tried to flee to somewhere else. And from what I see in verse 14, they were doing more than just catching the fleeing Israelites and delivering them to Babylon. It says they were cutting them down. They were killing them as they ran. These are unarmed refugees. These aren't soldiers. These are women. There are children among those numbers. Those who managed to escape Nebuchadnezzar were killed by the descendants of Esau. We have one brother's descendants killing the other brother's descendants so many years later. The verse also said that they took some of them as prisoners. They should have come to the rescue of their relatives instead of doing nothing else to help. But the actions they did take, they were aiding the enemy of Israel. And if you're aiding the enemy of Israel, you're fighting against God himself. Scripture says that he who blesses Israel, I will bless. He who curses Israel, I will curse. And that's what Edom was doing. They were fighting against God and aiding the enemy of Israel. Now, God was using Babylon as an instrument of judgment for Judah's sins and the rebellion of the people. Now, in all fairness, God warned them that judgment was coming, and they should have known. How many times did he send prophets to the northern kingdom of Israel? That their prophet after prophet warned them that judgment was coming if they didn't repent. They didn't repent, and the nation of Assyria overtook them in 722 BC. That should have got the people in Judah's attention. So God had sent prophet after prophet for them, and they refused to listen, and they refused to repent. So here come Nebuchadnezzar with the Babylonians. But the punishment that God sent was to carry the people into captivity. That was to be under his supervision, under his protection. There was going to be a remnant of the people that would return to the land. Right before Babylon invaded Judah, the prophet Habakkuk was crying out to God. He didn't understand why God was using such a wicked nation to punish his people. If you remember from our study in Habakkuk, he was crying out, Lord, I know that we deserve this. I know that we're guilty, but Babylon, of all nations, Babylon, why are you sending such a more wicked, a more perverse nation to judge your people? And then all of a sudden in the midst of that, Habakkuk had an epiphany. He realized that they're going to be okay. Things are going to get rough, and their lives are going to be changed, and they're going to live out their punishment in a foreign land, but they are going to live. Nonetheless, they are going to live. And Habakkuk 1 verse 12, Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We will not die. O Lord, you have appointed them to judge, and you, O Rock, have established them to correct. He knew that they were not going to be exterminated as a people. God's use of Babylon was rough, but it was also merciful at the same time. Compare that to what any other nation would have done when they go to war. Now, I'm certain that some people in Judah had put up a resistance, and they were probably cut down by Babylon as a result, but the majority surrendered, and they were taken away as captives. They lost everything, but they were still alive. And one day they would be able to return home and rebuild. But these Edomites, they had taken it upon themselves to start killing the people who were fleeing. They took judgment into their own hands. I think it also shows the level of cowardice of the Edomites. If they hated Israel so much, they should have confronted them face to face, have their leaders get together, have a discussion, try to negotiate some kind of solution peacefully at best. Or why not sit down and read Moses' account of Genesis, where Jacob and Esau, their ancestors, made peace with each other. But nope, Esau's family, the Edomites, waited until Big Bad Babylon had come in and done all the heavy fighting, And then they went in for the spoil, like a bunch of jackals or buzzards trying to eat what the lions have killed. I'm sure you've seen these on nature documentaries. Some of these smaller animals could never take down a wildebeest. They could never take down a gazelle. They wait for the lions to do it, and then they go in there and strip what they can off of a kill that they did not earn. And this is what the Edomites were doing. Not only did they not help their cousins, not only did they laugh at them, not only did they loot them, but they also killed the ones that were trying to flee for their lives. And it continues. We'll go to verses 15 and 16. The day of the Lord in the future. For the day of the Lord draws near on all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head, because just as you drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they had never existed. You know, today we live in an age of grace. There are nations that turn their backs on God. There's nations that are hostile to Christianity, and they still thrive for the moment. The day is coming when God is going to bring His wrath on all nations, as it says here. Not just Edom, but all nations. When the trumpet blows and the church is taken at the rapture, this begins the age known as the day of the Lord that is mentioned here. Not a literal 24-hour day, but it's a period of time. The time of Jacob's trouble, the great tribulation, the day of the Lord. But Edom isn't going to have to worry about that, because by that time they are going to be long gone, as we're going to see in just a few more verses. But verse 15 there should serve as a reminder to all nations today that a day of reckoning is coming. All of the things done by these nations, by even our own nation, will return on their own heads. And I find the use of the word drink fascinating there in verse 16. Obadiah is not talking about alcoholic beverages. He's not referring to any particular beverage in anything for that matter. We're going to shift the focus from what that beverage is to the container that beverages are placed in for drinking. That's going to help us better understand what God is saying here. Drinks are placed in cups. Yeah, no extra charge for that profound bit of insight right there. Drinks are placed in cups. But if you look in a Bible concordance, you're going to find countless mentions of cups, especially when it's a description of the utensils used in the temple. I mean, there's hundreds of cups. And I'm not talking about the ones in the temple. We're not talking about normal drinking vessels. I'm talking about the two different kinds of spiritual cups that the Bible speaks about. Number one, there is a cup of blessings that the Lord can fill for His people. For example, you see this in Psalm 16:5. The Lord is the portion of my inheritance and my cup. You support my lot. How about the famous Psalm 23 that everybody knows? You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. Now that is the good kind of cup. That's a cup that's full of blessings that we drink from, or that it is poured out on us. That's the good kind. But now we have the alternative type of cup number 2, the cup of judgment. This is the cup that contains the wrath of God. It's full of the punishment due for sins committed. A few verses that describe this will begin with Psalm 11, verse 16. Upon the wicked He will rain snares. Fire and brimstone and burning wind will be the portion of their cup. Then we got Psalm 75, verse 8. For a cup is in the hand of the Lord, and the wine foams. It is well mixed, and He pours out of this. Surely all the wicked of the earth must drain and drink down its dregs. Then Isaiah 51, verse 17. Rouse yourself, arise, O Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the Lord's hand the cup of His anger, the chalice of reeling, and you have drained to the dregs. One more, Jeremiah 25:15. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, says to me, take this cup of the wine of the wrath from my hand, and cause all the nations to whom I send you to drink it. Does that explain the second cup well enough to you? That cup is that the nations are drinking is the wrath of God. The cup of God's wrath is what Jesus drank when He went to the cross on our behalf. There were countless cups of well-deserved wrath ready to be distributed on Judgment Day. One of those had my name on it, and some had your name on it. And Jesus took that for us. He who knew no sin became sin on our behalf. He took of the cup of wrath that we had filled up, and he drank God's wrath, settling that for us once and for all. He was well aware of the severity of the wrath that filled those cups. In Mark 14:36, and he was saying, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And he had come to terms with this in John 18:11 at his arrest. So Jesus said to Peter, put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? Verse 16 in Obadiah is looking forward to the day of the Lord, when all of the nations that are left behind will be drinking from the cup that has their names on it. So let's look at that verse again, now that we know what is meant when he makes reference to a cup, when he makes reference to a drink, in Obadiah 16. Because just as you drank on my holy mountain, all the nations will drink continually. They will drink and swallow and become as if they never existed. Obadiah's prophecy said that they will drink from the cup eternally. Hell will never end. Those who go there will wish it did, but that cup of wrath that they spent their entire lives on earth filling up will never go dry. Your sin is either nailed to the cross and paid for by Christ, or it will be paid for in eternity, one or the other. Let's go on with verse 17 through 21, but I'm going to do something different right here. We're going to read the remainder of these verses and see what they are, with the exception of verse 18. I want to save verse 18 for last, and we'll close with it because it's the one that's fulfilled with chilling accuracy and detail. So we'll go with verse 17, and then verses 19, 20, and 21. But on Mount Zion there will be those who escape, and it will be holy, and the house of Jacob will possess their possessions. Then those in the Negev will possess the mountains of Esau, and those of Shephelah the Philistine plain also possess the territory of Ephraim and the territory of Samaria, and Benjamin will possess Gilead. And the exiles of this host of the sons of Israel, who are among the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem, who are in Sepharad, will possess the cities of the Negev. The deliverers will ascend Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be the Lord's. You know, Edom rejoiced when they saw Judah fall to Babylon. They thought, boy, that's the end of them. We're done with Judah. We don't ever have to deal with you anymore. That thorn in our side is gone. But here, God's making it clear that they are not gone. They're going to be back, and Israel is going to possess their possessions. Finally, we're not talking about the things that Babylon took, that Nebuchadnezzar stole from the temple. We're not talking about the things that Edom looted either. I'm talking about the place that God had promised to them a long time ago. You see, Israel has never completely taken control of all that was promised to Abraham by God. During the conquest of the Promised Land, the Israelites faced a few defeats here and there. Sometimes it was due to the sin of an individual. Sometimes it was due to the sin of the whole group. Sometimes it was due to a lack of faith, such as the exhibition of doubt when the 10 spies gave a bad report in comparison to Joshua and Caleb. That cost them 40 years of wandering. So sometimes a sin from one person or from the entire assembly caused them to have military defeats. So they never really occupied everything that they were supposed to, everything that was promised to Abraham so long ago. Their best, their peak, was under King Solomon. Under Solomon, they had the most territory in their history as a nation, but it was never as big as it was supposed to be. But we see here in Obadiah a future time in which that promise will finally be fulfilled. Now, the rapture of the church signals the beginning of the day of the Lord, the time in which the nations will drink from the cup of God's wrath. But after that comes a kingdom on earth in which Christ will reign for 1,000 years. It's called the millennial reign. During this millennial reign of Christ, Israel will finally enjoy the territory God has promised to Abraham. The original territory promised, according to most commentaries, is around 300,000 square miles. Now, you may not be familiar with square miles, so how big is 300,000 square miles? Well, to put that into perspective, in the United States, the state of Texas is close to that. 268,596 square miles. So Israel was supposed to be bigger than Texas, according to the promise that God gave to Abraham. Now compare that with what they occupy now, what Israel occupies today, 8,550 square miles. What's 8,500 square miles compared to 300,000? What they're on right now is 6 times smaller than our state of Florida. It's relatively the size of New Jersey. Now, at their peak, under King Solomon, estimates were around they had 30,000 square miles. But that's just a fraction of what they were promised so long ago. And at that time, during the millennial reign, they will receive it because God keeps His promises. Now, I will keep from boring you with about geography lessons here, but in the verses that we just covered, God even mentions which nation and which tribe will occupy which place. And all of this will come to pass during this millennial kingdom, this 1,000-year reign. And after the 1,000 years are over, the dead who are lost without Christ will be raised for judgment and then cast into the lake of fire. Verse 21 closes the book of Obadiah with a glimpse of that. Esau is going to be raised and be judged. Every Edomite will be raised and judged. Every American, every Australian, every German, every Irishman, every Ninevite, every Babylonian, every Frenchman, every Assyrian, every person who has ever lived and died without faith in God's deliverance through His Messiah will be raised for judgment on that day. But Edom won't be there. Edom won't be there during the cup of the wrath being poured out. They will be there for the judgment, but not the cup of the wrath. Says, where is Edom today? If they're not going to be there, that means they're out of existence now. So where are they? Where are the Edomites today? Now let's look at verse 18, which we save for last just for this purpose. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame. But the house of Esau will be as stubble, and they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. So we see that Jacob, or Israel, they're going to be brought back to being a nation again. They were brought back from Babylon after 70 years, hardly one generation. Now, after the time of Christ, when Rome leveled Jerusalem in AD 70, Israel was scattered yet again. But they reformed as an official nation again in May of 1948. Never before has a nation been completely scattered and then reform hundreds of years later and keep their ethnicity, keep their language, keep their religion, keep everything. That's never happened before. There always has been descendants of Jacob among us. There has always been the Jewish people among us. They have been dispersed so many times by the nations throughout the wars in history, but they still existed, and they still exist today. And now, since 1948, many of them have the chance to inhabit their homeland once again. So Israel is starting to find her way home. They're starting to regather in the homeland now. But Edom? Is Edom ever going to come back? You're going to have better luck finding chicken lips than you will finding an Edomite. If anyone claims to be an Edomite today, they're lying. God promised in verse 18 that fire would consume them and there would be no survivors of the house of Esau. Now remember that. We're going to see how that was fulfilled in just a second. But I want to look at the rest of the story before we cover the end of the story. All the centuries of war and hostility between Edom and Israel never stopped. It never ceased until Edom was eliminated permanently. But Obadiah, though he warned against it, he didn't live to see it. It was still hundreds of years into the future before it came to pass. Now, move forward from the days of Obadiah up until about the time of the birth of Christ in Bethlehem. Yeah, we're going to the Christmas story here. The Magi have come from the east, these Persian kingmakers, and they start asking, where is he who was born to be king of the Jews? Meaning, of course, Jesus. This gets the attention of King Herod. He pretends to take interest in worshiping the supposedly foretold king that they seek, but in actuality, he's seeking to destroy this child. Now, I'd always thought for years it's just because Herod felt threatened. He wanted to be the king of the Jews. He wasn't going to let some up-and-comer come up and take his place or win the hearts of the people. So he had told them, he says, find this child that I may worship him. But secretly, Herod wanted to kill Jesus. Now, we all know the story. After the Magi had met him and presented their gifts to Jesus, they were warned by an angel not to go back to Herod, but to go return to their land another way. When Herod had figured out that he was deceived by these Magi, he passed a decree that every male child under the age of 2 in that area and the surrounding area was to be killed. Every boy under the age of 2. Now, I don't know the number of the children under the age of 2. It could have been in the hundreds, it could have been in the thousands, could have been in the tens of thousands. But can you imagine for a moment the sadness and the cries coming from Israel during that time? Matthew described it. Matthew 2:18. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more. And in that, Matthew is actually quoting a prophecy from Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15, that foretold the same thing, Rachel weeping for her children. Now, Rachel, she was the wife of Jacob, the namesake of the nation of Israel. This was Esau's sister-in-law. The crime wasn't against an individual. It was against a nation, a people group, a family, Jacob's family. Now, who could possibly be behind this treachery on Jacob's family? Well, it was someone who was born in southern Palestine. His father's name was Antipater. He was an Edomite. His mother's name was Cyprus. Now, she was a Nabatean Arab princess from Petra, which is present-day Jordan, but she was also an Edomite. So this guy's father, Antipater, was an Edomite, and his mother, Cyprus, was an Edomite. And they had a child, none other than Herod the Great, Herod the King, Herod the Edomite. It was an Edomite family of the Herod dynasty who had John the Baptist beheaded. It was the same family who had the apostle James killed. And it was the same dynasty of Edomites that had all of the male babies aged 2 and under killed. Jacob and Esau's descendants were still at odds. Now, not all of the Edomites were evil people. You might remember some of them traveled and listened to Jesus during his ministry. You might remember them from an early study in one of our studies of Mark in chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. Jesus withdrew to the sea with his disciples, and a great multitude from Galilee followed, and also from Judea, and from Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, in the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. A great number of people heard of all that he was doing and came to him. So right there, from Jerusalem and Idumea, the Idumeans were Edomites. That's what it's called in the Greek text. So they were still around during the ministry of Jesus. We've seen that in the Bible. They come to hear him teach. The Edomites were still there when King Herod was alive. So when did they disappear? When did Obadiah 18 come to pass? About there being no survivor of the house of Esau. About them being all burned up. What happened to them? This is where we're going to have to turn from the pages of God's Word to the pages of history. And I've always clarified that when we make a move from the inspired divine Word, making a transition to outside sources. I always wanted to make sure that I'm quoting history and not the inspired divine Word of God, which is absolute truth. The source I'll be turning to comes from the historian Josephus. Now, we all know that the temple in Jerusalem and the city itself was completely destroyed in 70 AD. But I want you to know the full story of this and how it came to pass, because that's also when the Edomites were eliminated. Now, you have to go back to 2 years prior to 70 AD, leading to the events leading up to that destruction. Beginning in 68 AD, there was a group known as the Zealots. Now, we mentioned in our study of the disciples that one of them was called Simon the Zealot. These were a group of nationalists nationalists. They were a group of political radicals, and some of them belonged to a secret society called the Sicarii, where these people would carry these hidden daggers. They catch a Roman guard out by himself. There's no witnesses. They eliminate a Roman, just one by one, kind of picking them off. Now, was Simon the Zealot part of the Sicarii? We don't know, but we know that he ended up following Christ. But now this group of zealots continued on after the ascension of Christ, and they've gotten really radical. They've started ramping up their opposition to Rome. No more were they lurking in the shadows and picking off soldiers one by one. It was an all-out war. The zealots received word that Emperor Vespasian is planning an attack, so they asked the Edomites for help. Yeah, these descendants of Jacob are asking the descendants of Esau for help. Now, not all of the descendants of Jacob, not all the Israelites were zealots. As I said, this was a radical group right here. But they were still descendants of Jacob nonetheless, asking for the descendants of Esau for help. And they agreed to it. Yeah, maybe the prophecy of Obadiah sank in with them, or so it seems at the moment, because their problem during Obadiah's time is they did not come to the aid of Israel. But at this time, they are. The Edomites sent 20,000 people to Jerusalem. Now, all of these pieces of the Bible are going to fit into this. Do you remember Annas, the high priest in the Bible? There were two high priests mentioned in the Bible during Jesus' public ministry, Annas and Caiaphas. Now, the high priest was taken from the Sadducees. That's who that come from. And they figure prominently into the events of his death. Annas had been high priest from AD 6 to AD 15. But the Romans didn't like him. So the Romans removed him from office and appointed Caiaphas as high priest. Yeah, Rome just come in and they said, we don't care what your traditions are. We don't care what God's will is. We want Caiaphas as high priest, so they kicked Annas out of it. Now, 5 of Annas' sons succeeded him as high priest, and he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest who was in office at the time of Jesus' ministry. Now, Annas is still called the high priest, even though he was not serving officially in that capacity at the time, but his power was obvious. The people still saw Annas as the high priest. They didn't care that Rome said that Caiaphas was. To them, Annas was their high priest, and his power was obvious because when Jesus was arrested, he was brought to Annas first rather than Caiaphas. Now, it is this Annas who was told takes it upon himself to lock out these 20,000 Edomites from the city. When the Edomites show up to help the zealots, it was said that Annas locked the gate and wouldn't let these Edomites in. He didn't want them there, but that's what the zealots told the Edomites. Now, the Edomites, locked outside, became angry, but they didn't head home. They stayed there, and they camped outside the city overnight. Maybe they were plotting what they were going to do now. Maybe they were coming up with another strategy. Josephus records that night there was a violent lightning storm outside, and the people viewed it as a bad omen, that God was displeased with something, whether it be the zealots, whether it be the Edomites outside the gate, something, or the rejection of Christ, possibly. So these Edomites, or these Idumeans, they cut through the city gate in the midst of this storm. And in their rage, those 20,000 Edomite men killed 8,500 Israelis inside the city. And then they looted the city of Jerusalem, just as they did back when Babylon took them captive so long ago. History tends to repeat itself, doesn't it? Have you noticed that? So these zealots and the Idumeans, the zealots and the Edomites, they joined forces and they killed 2 of the high priests. Not Annas, but they managed to take Annas' son. But then the Idumeans find out that they have been lied to by the zealots about Annas being the traitor. And they just killed Annas' son, and they found out it was all for a lie. So they backed off. They retreated from that battle. In the meantime, the zealots, they went on a massive killing spree of anyone who opposed them. And you'd think that all this ruckus would eventually make the news in Rome. Well, it did. When Emperor Vespasian of Rome heard about this, he delays his attack of Jerusalem. We know from history Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. It almost was in AD 68. But Vespasian decides just let them keep killing each other for a while before he finally steps in and finishes the job. Now there's one of the zealots, John of Geshela. He breaks away from the group and forms his own band of zealots. Again, these are all small pieces that fit into the grand picture of the puzzle at the end. So I know it may be confusing, but you can rewind this or look at the transcript and it'll help. Josephus then takes us to June of AD 68. Vespasian finally makes a move to attack, but not on Jerusalem. He attacks Idumea. He attacks the home of the Edomites. He tore it down and he set fire to everything. And he slew 10,000 people that remained there, took 1,000 or so captive, and then he drove the rest out of town. Now, 10 months after that, there's another log by Josephus. This is in April of AD 69. There are some Edomites that were living in Jerusalem causing havoc. They were not aware that their homeland was destroyed by Vespasian during the last 10 months. They're too busy being destructive within the walls of Jerusalem. So they finally betray this John the Zealot and everything that we mentioned earlier. They loot his supplies, and then they drive him and all the other zealots to barricade themselves inside the temple. That was in April of 69. Now, May 1st of AD 69, the previous order of the zealots, they're barricaded inside the temple. There's a man by the name of Simon Ben-Georius that begins to rule the city, and he has the support of the Edomites. Then we move on to August 6th of AD 70, according to Josephus's writings. Fire was cast inside the temple, completing the destruction of the temple. So Titus of Rome, not the Titus whom Paul wrote to in one of his epistles, but Titus, a ruler of Rome, waited in the Tower of Antonia there within the walls of Jerusalem. He was going to storm the temple the next day after the fire was done and see what was left. Well, when we go on to August 14th of AD 70, Titus goes into the temple, what's left of it anyway, and he loots it. He takes the remaining priests that were there, and he executes them. The Romans begin to sacrifice to their gods right next to the temple. Not inside of it, but next to it. And they now had so much gold and so much precious metal and valuables that were plundered from there that on the Tuesday, the 14th of August, it was said that gold in Syria sold for half its former value. So Josephus then takes us to August 21st, AD 70. The Edomites decided that in light of Rome's victory and Rome's new control over Jerusalem, that it might be in their best interest to surrender to Rome while they still could. So they selected 5 men among their leaders and sent these 5 men to Titus in an attempt to strike a deal, to broker peace or broker for their lives, just some kind of a bargain. Now Titus was reluctant to make the deal. He wasn't sure if he could trust these Edomites or these Idumeans. But in the end, he decided to go ahead and make a deal for peace with the Edomites. But remember that Simon Ben-Georius guy earlier who was in charge right before Rome came in and put their foot down? Well, he took those 5 men who just got through talking to Titus and made peace with them, and he killed those 5 men right after they left Titus's place. So the Edomites, they're at a loss. They didn't know what to do. Their commanders were taken away and arrested. They made an attempt to flee the city, but that failed. Then we go to August 25th of 70. Titus gives a speech in order to save what remains of the city. The temple's already gone, but some of Jerusalem still stands. And it's a big, long speech recorded in Josephus's account of the wars. And he tells them, hey, you can just bow down to me. You can just, give up, quit clinging to your old ways, your ideologies, and we will spare the city. But the Jews chose death over surrender, and that's exactly what they received. September 2nd of AD 70, there was a final siege by Rome, and 1,100,000 Jews died that day. Let that number just sink in for a minute. 1,100,000. Why were so many there during the time of war and time of destruction? The residents of Jerusalem surely knew what was going on with Rome, so why were there still 1,100,000 people there? Well, these people had shown up from miles around for the Feast of Unleavened Bread at the worst possible time. Most of those probably had no idea what was going on. But among that slaughter of all those people that day, all those that were consumed by fire by Rome, The last of the few Edomites who lived were killed and also consumed by fire. Their relatives all died and burned when their homeland was destroyed, when they decided to go ahead and attack Idumea instead of Jerusalem first. All that remained was the remnant that was in Jerusalem. There was one last act of defiance. These very people who we read about in Obadiah, who played a role in Babylon's destruction of Solomon's temple in 587 BC, were now playing a role in Rome's destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Once again, they were there killing and looting, just as they had done during the time of Obadiah. And, just as God had prophesied, they were completely slaughtered and burned up. Not a single Edomite remained. The nation of Edom, the house of Esau, was officially extinct, thereby fulfilling verse 18 of Obadiah, this verse that was written nearly 600 years earlier with incredible predictive accuracy as only God can do. Then the house of Jacob will be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, but the house of Esau will be as stubble, and they will set them on fire and consume them, so that there will be no survivor of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken.